Hello, my name is Alan Vaughn. Welcome Secretary Julian Castro and his mother, Rosie Castro, here on Rise Up Weekend to Living the Legacy. How are y'all doing this afternoon?
Great to be with you.
Great.
Good.
Looking forward to being with you.
Really excited for this opportunity to interview y'all and see a little bit more about y'all's experiences and seeing how y'all have worked throughout voting throughout y'all's lifetimes. And so I just would love to go ahead and go into some of these questions. Mrs. Castro, nearly 50 years ago, you were a voting rights trailblazer in the Latino community in South Texas. What was your journey like at that time? And looking at today's movements, energy, and challenges, what seems familiar and what's different?
Well, there's a lot of things that are similar, but back then, one of the differences that in Texas, for example, the folks that were in charge of government were the Democrats. And of course, those were the Southern Democrats. And when they redistricted, their objective was to keep out Blacks and Latinos to be able to maintain those districts for white Democrats. And so we challenged that through MALDEF, through lawsuits. And of course, once you had the voting rights, voting rights came in, it made it a lot easier because of the pre-clearance, the Section 5, which now we don't have. But one of the things that I did for quite a number of years was to work with MALDEF, with a lot of groups of students and then volunteers to do some of the research for the trials that were held and for the folks that were going to Washington to speak before the Senate committees on voting rights. At that time, you can imagine, we didn't have the computers. So right. Some of the things that we were doing were coloring in the maps to show how redistricting was affecting and where Latinos were, where Chicanos were, where Blacks were, and how they had been left out of these new districts. We also did a lot of different research on different cities in Texas, for example, Corpus Christi, to look at how the districts had gotten that way. So we looked at covenant restrictions. We looked at the history of people elected for 30, 40 years, and how they had not represented our folks. So we did a lot of the legs research that was needed for both the lawsuits and for the hearings.
Wow, that is a lot of work. So, I mean, thank you. That sounds like you've done a lot. Would you say it was really difficult?
Well, I think what was difficult was that we really had hope that I had been very active in the Young Democrats, for example. That's how I started, and doing a lot of voter registration, that kind of stuff. So it was our hope. I was part of what was known as the Liberal Democrats, and there was the Conservative Democrats. It was our hope that we would one day have some equity, be able to really get people elected. There were a handful in San Antonio, literally 5 Latinos that had any kind of elected positions. We're talking about the 1960s. And so It was our hope that, we could expand that. There were people like Willie Velasquez working on voter registration. All of us had been young and were coming up, but they were making the difference then. We had hoped that, we could show through data and people would actually understand that we needed to have that representation. But of course, that didn't happen. Ultimately, you had the lawsuits and then you had the Voting Rights Act. So it was difficult from that standpoint. And in some ways, it's hard not to lose your faith in the system because the system was not working for you at the time. So you had to challenge the system.
So Secretary Castro, you first ran for office and won when you were 26 years old. What would you say to young adults who feel like they're too young to make a difference?
I'd say go for it. If you have a passion for public service, you know the community that you want to represent, you have great ideas, then there's no perfect age and there's not going to be any perfect time in your life. We need more people to step up into public service positions who have great ideas and who are energetic and have a passion for serving others and who have great integrity. I got elected at 26 to the San Antonio City Council I know that I was only able to do that because of the work of previous generations, including my mom and her generation. In fact, she ran for city council in San Antonio at the age of 23 in 1970.
Wow.
At the time, there were very, very few women and very few people of color who were able to get elected because we didn't have single member districts. You had to run citywide. That changed because of the activism and lawsuits that were filed. And eventually we had single member districts, and I could get elected in 2001 at such a young age. That wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the generations that came before of activists, of organizers, of elected officials that were trying to change things.
Wow. So really, they've set it up for you to where you've been able to do it now. That's great to hear. What kind of difficulties did you run into when you were first running?
I think anybody who's running for the first time, especially if you're young, there's always a question of your experience. I was 26. I looked like I was probably 20 years old at the time. So I had to overcome that. Also, a lot of times people wonder, where in the world do I get started? I don't know, if I want to run for office, but I don't know where or how I get started. And so for me, it was a matter of getting out there into the neighborhoods, knocking on doors, making phone calls to people who are active in the district, and little by little gaining support. There's also the question of campaign resources. I don't come from a wealthy family, and a lot of people who want to run, they don't have a lot of resources, and they're not used to fundraising. So there's a question of how do you get started there? And none of those things are necessarily easy, but they're also not obstacles that are not overcomable. You can overcome them.
Right.
And fortunately today, you have a lot of organizations out there, whether it's Run for Something or any number of others, that are there to help new candidates, especially young progressive candidates, get elected.
I see. Okay, well, your successes over the years have required engaging, across both lines that divided racial, partisan, generational, and beyond. So what learnings would you share with young leaders today, or those that would want to run for office, such as you did at a young age?
Number one, that you should know why you're doing it. For me, it's because I had a chip on my shoulder about San Antonio, about the community that I came from. I'd grown up on the west side of the city in a very Mexican-American area, got to Stanford University. And what I saw was that in comparison to the Bay Area, the community that I came from had lower income levels, lower education levels, seemed less prepared for the future. The chip on my shoulder was that I wanted more people where I came from in my hometown to have greater opportunity in life, like I was able to have, so that they could also achieve their dreams. So my advice would be, know why you're doing it. And then secondly, that you have to stand for something. If you're going to be in a position of public trust, stand for something and let voters know what you stand for. And then maybe most importantly, when you're actually elected, when you govern, do what you say you were going to do, so that people can have confidence not only in you, but in the entire system. And that's how we encourage more participation from people.
Right. Well, that's great advice going forward for, those that are wanting to run for office, especially, at any age. So that's great to hear. So, you encourage those that are young to run, and to run based on their own ideals. Why do you stand up for voting rights yourself?
I stand up for voting rights because such a fundamental part of being an American. And one way that we respect human rights around the world is to make sure that every single person who's eligible has a say at the ballot box. That is the voice that somebody has in our democracy. And it's a fundamental underpinning of our country. The stronger our democracy, the more it reflects the will of the people, the better off we are as a country. The more we erode that, the weaker our nation gets. And the more we leave people out, the worse we are as a nation. And so I believe it's essential to make voting convenient, make the ballot box easily accessible.
Oh, well, that's wonderful to hear. I just want to thank y'all for your time that you've given us. I mean, if you have anything else to add, we'd love to hear it.
I don't know if you want to answer.
No,
that
I
question.
just think that what Julian said, there's a couple of things. One is that I really firmly believe that if you want to run for office, you should be entrenched in your community. You should have worked in that community. And so that people know your work before you run. Also, just to mention the voting rights thing, I got to see firsthand what happens when we don't have a voice, when we didn't have a voice. And for many people of color, it has been a real struggle to get that voice. We can't afford to have that taken away from us. And so that's one of the reasons I think we all are trying to fight really hard to make sure that these laws that some folks are trying to pass in many of the states just don't get passed. And if they do, that we find a way to make sure we get rid of them. And it is our hope that the federal folks, that the Congress and the Senate might be able to enact the kinds of bills, the voting rights bill, that would reestablish some of those rights.
Yeah, I'm excited to see the strides we have in the future regarding voting rights, and really excited to see those young people now going ahead and running for office so that they can affect change later in the future. So again, I just want to thank y'all so much for joining us on Rise Up Weekend and living the legacy. You guys have been great. Secretary Castro, thank you. Mrs. Castro, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.